Welcome to this module of Professor Messer's free CompTIA Network Plus certification training course, the online training course that includes unlimited calling on nights and weekends. This module is on network troubleshooting methodologies, and this is very much a by-the-book kind of module. We're going to learn a process, a methodology here. So a lot of the ideas that you'll bring to the table whenever you're having a problem on the network, in future modules will actually show you how to troubleshoot those pieces. But first, before we begin even that process of thinking about troubleshooting, what are the steps we should go through in our mind? This comes from modules that are built on N10-004, our Network Plus certification exam, section 4.6, where given a scenario, we need to implement the following network troubleshooting methodologies, and you can see them listed here. And we start with information gathering, we go through possible causes, we're building a list, we're deciding whether we need to escalate this or not. Ultimately, we get to where we test this solution and then finally document the pieces. So let's step through each one of these and get a feel for what we should be thinking about every time we have a problem, every time we'd like to step through these types of issues. Let's start with information gathering. When we first find out that there's some type of problem or something that we need to address, we need to first start by information gathering. We need to go to as many sources as we can and find out what's going on. Before you start making any changes, before you jump to any conclusions, you need to think about all of those pieces. So this is a critical step, this gathering of the information that we're getting. And usually we're doing this by asking questions. If somebody says, I'm having a problem, you can start asking, what type of problem are you having? Are there error messages that you're seeing on your screen? How often is this problem occurring? Is it something that you can replicate at will, or is it something that occurs randomly throughout the day? These are all constant issues, and we can drill down on information gathering from there. We may ask multiple people, well, you're sitting right next to this person who's having a problem. Are you seeing this type of issue? Are you seeing this type of slowdown? When do you see this problem occur? And get as much information as possible. We also need to think about when the last change was. If we come in on a Monday morning and somebody's having a problem, did we make changes over the weekend? Was there an issue or a change that we made to the network Sunday night that now may manifest itself in problems that we're having on Monday? And so we need to think about what happened in the past, and if possible, go back to our documentation and look at all the different components that were changed. There's a historical record, hopefully, that you have now in your formalized change control process that allows you to go back in time and use that as another source of information gathering. And usually there will be logs, there will be information in routers and switches. You may have a lot of different places that you can go to gather this information. So please use it. Examine those logs and look in the Windows event viewer. Look in your switch configuration. During the time this person had a problem, did anything pop up in the log around that time frame? And that's going to be really useful to you when you go back and start looking through what happened at what time, and occasionally information gathering from all these different sources can help piece together this puzzle of what's going on. Now that we've gathered some information from our users, it would be nice to know the scope of this particular problem. Is this something affecting everybody, or is it only affecting a small area of the network? And you can start to do some of those things by running some uptime tests, run some pings, run some trace routes. In another module, we're going to talk about the process of actually doing these and how they function on the network. But running these types of issues can help you determine, is anybody able to get out to the internet? Can people communicate to a certain IP subnet on your network? If they can or can't, can I do a trace route and find out just how far they can get? Perhaps I have a router type of problem. You can also ask around. Some of the best sources of information are calling up people you know in another building and saying, I'm having some reports of some problems in that building. Are you seeing any types of problems? And if so, what do those problems look like to you? And if you begin gathering and listing out where these problems might be, you can put together a much better view of where things might be going on the network. You may be at a point where you just can't find out that information by calling around or running some tests. You may need to get up out of your chair, grab your laptop, and start looking around. Walk around those buildings, see what's going on. This is especially useful if there are wireless issues, because wireless has so many different variables associated with it, and there are so many things that might cause a problem with a wireless signal. It's very useful to walk around with your laptop and get an idea and a feel for just how far that signal is going, and are there any issues communicating over that wireless network. network. It just really helps sometimes if you are there in that facility experiencing the same problem that the users are experiencing, because they may be telling you about the problem from their perspective, but because you know how the network works behind the scenes, underneath the surface, you have a much better idea when you see an error come up of what might be causing that problem. So it really helps if you are on site when some of these problems occur. And when you get there, you may find that when somebody says the internet is down, that perhaps it's not the internet. Maybe they just can't access a particular server that's on the internet. Or maybe when somebody says, I'm having a problem getting to a certain server, maybe your entire link to the internet is down. You're never quite sure until you put some scope around that. And that's why if you can understand what the scope of and how many things are affected by this particular problem, you have a much better idea of how you can solve the issue. I've mentioned a couple of times in this module up to this point about your change control process. You do have a change control process, right? Well, if you don't, you should start thinking about at least putting something in, even if it's not a formalized committee where there are certain times of a morning that you are able to take devices down or not. It still becomes extremely important when you want to be able to organize changes, be able to roll back when there's a problem with the changes you've made. And so change control becomes a very important process in this overall troubleshooting, because now you can go back and find out, has something changed? Or perhaps where that person was when a problem occurred. I worked with an organization. I've changed the name here to Bill. We'll call this person Bill. And whenever there was a problem on the network, one of our first questions was, where's Bill? Is he in a closet somewhere? Is he working on something right now? He always seems to touch something and it breaks. So wherever Bill happens to go, we always seem to have a problem. That's another part of determining if anything has changed. Let's ask Bill, did you make a change to that router? Was anything changed with that switch? And if you don't have a formalized change control process, you can see this can become very chaotic because you're never quite sure when somebody's going to make a change to a very important infrastructure device. One important thing to remember is that ones and zeros act the same way every time. They're very predictable in what happens over the network. If something is changing with the way people are communicating, it's because something with your infrastructure equipment, your configurations, it's because you told the ones and zeros to do something different. So think about those changes you've made. Occasionally, even small minor things may have a dramatic effect on the way that the network operates. Sometimes automated monitoring tools can be really useful. There are a number of open source monitoring tools, a lot of commercial monitoring tools out there that can give you at least a feel for what's going on. At a very high level, might be able to tell you utilization or simply uptime. I call those red-green boxes. I just want to know if a server is communicating on the network. If it goes from green to red, then I can do something about it. Or maybe you want something that is able to give you different levels of service. Maybe your throughput on the network is something that you'd like to measure. So it depends on what the goals of your organization is as to the type of monitoring tools that you will get. But you can also think about using those to determine, has something changed? Because you can always go back to those monitoring tools, look through those logs and see, oh yes, we were running fine until this time of the day and then something happened. So those monitoring tools can be very, very useful. Now that we've identified a problem, we've now gathered our information, we've looked through what may have changed, then we need to make a list. We need to find out what the most probable cause of this might be. And if you are in a group of people, you may want to get everybody together in a room, get a whiteboard, get a blank whiteboard, just start writing some things out. What could this problem possibly be for the big major issues that you might have that are really affecting your organization? That's a great thing to do, because now you get ideas from everybody. It might be 3 or 4 things, it might be 50, it might be 100 different things that might be the issue, but you can get everything up on the board and think about how these things may be interacting with each other. The idea is to determine what the problem might be, but also you might want to make a list of things just to make sure that you know what the problem might not be. If you're listing out problems and you're going through this list and say, well, we might have a problem with the database server, and yet other people are able to use that database server, then you know it's not the server itself that's your issue. So you can start crossing through some of these things that in your mind might be questionable. This should be usually a very free-form process, especially for these very difficult problems. They happen randomly. They affect large parts of the network. You're never quite sure when it's going to happen. You should all get together and think about all kinds of different ideas about what might be the issue. I've been in environments where it has been something that's very, very difficult to troubleshoot, like a firmware problem inside of a switch. I've also seen problems where the cleaning crew comes in and plugs in a vacuum cleaner and takes down part of the network because of the interference caused by the motor inside of the vacuum cleaner. And if you always notice it's happening at a certain time of the day, it may be worth it to go out and hang out during the network during that area at that certain time of the day to find out what's going on. You're never quite sure, and sometimes technology is just weird that way. Now at least we have a list of things that we think might be causing this problem, but we should also think about the impact that this problem is having to the goals of our organization. You should have procedures in place. If this is going to be a problem that affects a large group of people, or you're going to need to make changes to the network to solve this issue that is going to affect a lot of people, you may want to make some phone calls. So hopefully you have a set of processes and procedures for escalating these problems. If it's a problem affecting this type of service, we should call managers, we should call directors, we should call vice presidents. We should make people aware of what's going on. Send emails, send text messages, whatever happens to be, so that those people are informed. Your goal here is to protect your organization. You should at least, even though you're working with computers, you're working with networks, it's a very technical job, you should absolutely have some perspective onto what your overall goals of your organization are. Is the goal of your organization a manufacturing plant? Are you making cars or making widgets that need to come off an assembly line? You need to think about how your change is going to affect that. Are you a printing press? Do you sell insurance? Is this a sales environment that's retail, that's open during the day? All of those things should go into your mind. You should think about, what am I doing that's going to have an impact on what we're trying to do as an organization? Ultimately, you want to protect your customers. And as an IT person, you can think about your customers not only as people who would come into your organization from outside and purchase something from you, for instance, or it may be people within your own organization. The accounting department, you may consider a customer of the IT group. Your manufacturing arm may be a customer of your IT group. You're all the same company, but you're providing a service to them. You want to be sure that they're thought of and taken care of whenever you're making these types of changes. And ideally, if there's people who are within your organization who just don't have a core competency in a particular type of problem you're having, then maybe you want to bring in other smart people who can help you with this particular kind of problem. If you're having an issue with a database server and nobody in your organization is well versed on how that database server works, pick up the phone, call technical support. They'll tell you who you can talk to. If they can't fix the problem, they'll certainly give you some options on what you can do. And it's amazing sometimes how people will not pick up the phone. It's such a simple thing. Get some people on the phone and start talking over what the problem might be and get them involved in the process. You're better off doing that early on during this process than waiting until later. And at the end of the day, it's just a phone call. It's not going to hurt anybody. Now we have a list of what these problems might be. We have called the people and made sure we escalated this to the right folks. Now we need to really create a plan of how we're going to fix this. So there needs to be a plan A, a plan B, a plan C. If the first plan A doesn't work, what are we going to do? If plan B doesn't work, what are we going to do? You should always have a plan on what you're going to accomplish and the things that you'll need to make that plan operate. We usually prioritize these plans based on a number of different things. It may be how quick we're able to make this change. It may be how easy we're able to make this change. It may be based on if we really think this change is going to really have the effect we think. Usually we list the easy things first. We make sure that if we think it might be a cable problem, we'll swap out the cable. That just takes a few minutes. If we think this might be a database indexing issue, that could take hours to re-index a database. So can we do some simple things first just to make sure it's not the cable before we go through these hours and hours and hours of waiting for this database to re-index just to see if that caused the problem? So you can see, even though you might have a higher priority that might really be the database indexing, maybe we'll swap the cable out first just to make sure. So very important that we prioritize those things. Let's think about when we make a change, if that causes another problem, how do we go back? How do we switch back to the way it was? We should always have a fallback plan. If you're going to go through the process of making this change and it makes it worse, you need to be sure that you can back that out. That's part of a normal process of change control, and make sure you also have it when you're implementing these types of troubleshooting plans. Some of these plans you may come across are just completely crazy, impractical, but you should at least consider all of them. Think about how the type of issue you're having may be affected by what you're going to make changes to. And if this is something that is a database server and the idea was that, well, let's swap out the memory or let's completely replace it with another computer entirely. That may have seemed crazy when you started into this issue, but when you're 6 hours into this problem, you may think, that's a pretty good idea. That doesn't seem so crazy anymore. Let's bring in another machine, swap it out, and see if that causes the problem to go away. Very interesting how we go through this troubleshooting process, but hopefully you've already thought of that as your plan D or plan E, and you already have an idea in your mind of how you're going to implement that. When you make a change to anything on the network, you should always test that change. It doesn't matter if that's something that is very, very small or something that is very, very large. We need to be sure we test it. And if the problems that we're coming across are done very simply, then we can make and test these changes very, very easily. So if we are, for instance, waiting on new hardware to get here, we've decided to swap out the database server, but we have to wait a few hours before that database server arrives. There's other things we can do in the meantime. Let's swap the cable out that we were thinking of doing to begin with. Since we're going to be standing around for a couple of hours waiting on hardware, why not make ourselves useful and make sure that at least it wasn't the cable that we were working with? Just make sure that the ideas that we put in place are following the plans that you have made so that you're going right down the line and nobody's going to be surprised by anything you're doing. This is really, really important. Please only change one thing at a time. Ultimately, we're going to need to figure out what the root cause of this problem is. And if you go to this database server and you change out the memory, swap the cable, and replace some of the drivers in the machine, and it works, you're never quite sure exactly which one of those things resolved the issue. Now, I recognize that sometimes it may be a high-stress situation. That server may be incredibly important, and so it may not be practical, but it should be a very rare occasion where you do not swap one thing at a time. Make sure that you know, because if you solve this problem and another database server has this issue, you already know what the root cause was, and you can solve it. Oh, we changed the driver and it solved everything for us. So we don't have to wait for new hardware. We don't have to swap the cable. We just change a driver and it's done. So very important that we do things one thing at a time. When you make a change, that is not the same thing as fixing the problem. Now, ultimately, of course, it will be when we finally find the root cause of what we were doing. But until we've really tested the solution, we're never quite certain that we solved the problem. So make sure if you make any changes, have a test plan that you're going to run. If we swap the cable, make sure we can still communicate on the network, make sure that we can still do the speed test that we were doing before, and see if the cable change really did solve the issue. You really don't want to get in a situation where, oh, I think it's the monitor. We'll swap the monitor out. Okay, I swapped your monitor. See you later. Not realizing that the monitor you swapped out actually is something that doesn't work on the machine you plugged it into. Always test these changes. When you get into networking equipment, routers and switches, these are extremely complex environments with a lot of different moving parts inside of there, if you will. And so we want to be sure if we make one minor change that really is a minor change and that doesn't affect anything else, and then ultimately it's really solving the problem that we set out to solve. Once we've made this change, we need to find out what the result of that was. We did some testing. We think that we've solved the issue, but we need to find out, was this now a better solution? Did this fix our problem? Did we fix the problem, but the performance decreased? Did we fix the problem and have the performance increase? We're not going to know until we identify what the effects were of the solution that we implemented. Sometimes you will be surprised. You will go through these issues and trying to figure out what's going on. You really need to think about what's happening with the problem, the switch in the router that we might be working on. And if we start moving some things around, we change something in a router, you may find that applications stop working, or we make a modification to a switch, you may find out that different people in the organization can't communicate to other parts of the organization anymore. This can really cause a lot of issues, and it is one thing causes another, and causes another, can create quite a few issues. So make sure you look at the effects of what you're changing and that it doesn't have any other problems on the network. Sometimes these results are very easy to determine. If somebody isn't communicating and you make a change, now they can communicate. Very simple. We know it worked. Yes or no. Is it up or is it down? I like those kinds of problems because we know immediately if we were able to solve the issue. Now, sometimes these are longer term things. If people are saying over the last week, things have gotten progressively slower. We may want to put a change in place and let it sit for a little bit. Let it sit for a day or two and find out, did this solve your performance problem? Is this now much better than it was before? Is it the same? Is it worse? And by looking at this over a longer period of time, we can think about how that might have resolved the issue or other changes we might be able to make. Sometimes they're extremely complex models based around these things. If you make a change to a router, it may have a dramatic effect on what's going on in your environment. So you have to think about a very broad perspective. And again, having that plan in place and being able to change it and then make a backup plan of that can become very important if things go incredibly difficult, incredibly wrong once you have implemented this solution. There's a universal truth everywhere I go is that everybody just loves to document. I know it's boring. It's not something that you really want to spend a lot of time on usually, but what you'll find is that if you get past that part where you're considering this documentation process to be a drudge and you're really thinking about how you're going to be able to use this documentation later, it becomes a little useful. What you find is that now you've got a very valuable solution to this very complex problem that we were suffering. It's probably going to be the case that someone's going to run into this type of problem again. So if you're able to document the issue and you're able to say, yes, we spent 6 hours on this, but ultimately we found by changing the driver, we were able to improve the performance of our database server, somebody else is going to need that in the future. If you work for a very large organization, you may find the things that you do in your location, people on another site may have no idea that that occurred. So having documentation of that allows them to search their knowledge base and discover, oh, over at the other site, all they did was change a driver and it worked. Let me give that guy a call. Let me find out what they did based on the documentation, and we'll make a similar change here. That's why when I said change one thing at a time so that we can determine the root cause, this is why. So we can really have a record of what we did to ultimately solve the problem. Sometimes we're changing one thing at a time and we know exactly what the issue is. If we don't change it one thing at a time, then we're going to have a problem really coming up with exactly what was the resolution for this particular kind of problem. Let's think about what we've just now learned about going through the troubleshooting process and the methodologies that we should have in place. So let's go through some questions. Our first question is, which initial step is the foundation of the entire troubleshooting process? Where do we start whenever we hear that there's a problem we need to resolve? Well, we need to think about gathering information. We need to think about asking people about what they're seeing, how they're seeing it, and drilling down into understanding more about the experiences they're having with the problem that they're suffering with. Another question, what should we do after making a change? Well, we won't know if the change actually worked unless we tested it. And so we want to be sure that if we are making a change to a cable, if we're changing out hardware, if we're changing a driver, we want to see what the results of that were. So we must test that solution to see if it actually was able to resolve our overall issue. And then finally, what should always be done after a solution has been found? Well, if we just talked about this, very important, something we'll need all the time is to document what we did. Make sure that we can go back later and look at our documentation to determine what really happened when we had this problem and when we resolved this issue. Well, that covers everything in section 4.6 for troubleshooting the network and understanding the methodologies and process we'll go through from the information gathering process all the way down to the documentation. We know now the steps that we're going to go through so that when we start looking at how to solve these issues, we know exactly the steps in the process that we're going to go through every single time. For more Network Plus videos, to participate in our message boards and much more, you can visit our website, freenetworkplus.com.